Before you turn to the more detailed modules that constitute this tutorial series, we wanted to step back and offer an overview of the steps and standards and some of the underlying philosophy behind our framework. There are two major philosophic points in our framework. The first is that planning, performance measurement, and evaluation are all part of a continuous quality improvement cycle. And so you'll see throughout the tutorials that our goal is always to see evaluation as something that feeds planning and is fed by planning and performance measurement. The second point is that our CDC evaluation framework is a type of what's called utilization-focused evaluation or utility-focused approach. What that means is that we're aiming, of course, to prove something, but more important, we're aiming to improve something, a program, a policy, or procedure. And so you can see from our framework that that sixth step is ensuring use and sharing lessons learned, and that's the essence of what we're trying to accomplish. So you see throughout the steps and standards and throughout these tutorials that the goal is always what can we do to make choices that will lead to more use of findings by more people. Let me quickly walk through the steps one by one, and then I'll talk a little bit about how the steps are viewed together. So the first step is engaging stakeholders. That means deciding who needs to be part of the design and implementation of the evaluation for it to make a difference. Now, often you've engaged these people at some detail when you created the project itself. So if so, you're piggybacking on that. Sometimes there are unique stakeholders you're going to want to engage. But we'll see that this flavor of stakeholders, although we call it step one, flows throughout all the steps of the framework. The second step is called describing the program. And here we want you to draw a soup-to-nuts picture of the program. We want you to make sure there's clarity and consensus on what the activities of the program are and what the intended outcomes are. Sometimes we use a logic model for this. That's certainly not the only way to do it. The third step is where it all comes together. We call this utility-focused evaluation, and so this focusing the evaluation step is really the big leveraging part of our approach. Here you're going to decide which evaluation questions are the key ones. Michael Patton, a famous evaluator, once said that for any complex program, there are 50 viable evaluation focuses. So we'll show you, using some decision rules, how to trim that down to the most important questions for this evaluation this time. Now, we call those steps 1, 2, 3, but the reality is you can really start with any one of those steps. You just need to hit all three of them before you proceed on to data collection. And also you'll note, and I'm sure you'll experience this as you go through these tutorials, that insights at any one of the three steps may cause you to cycle back. So you may start on step 1 with stakeholders, get to step 2 and describe your program. Then suddenly when you're setting your evaluation focus, you identify an outcome perhaps you hadn't realized before, or a stakeholder who turns out to be important. Right? In my own work, I tend to start with step 2, the program description, and I use that myself to frame the stakeholder engagement and then the evaluation focus. But any of these steps in any order will work. The important thing of our framework is that you try all three before you proceed on to data collection. The next three steps are really similar to any data collection procedure you've ever been part of, but you'll see that we call these titles something a little bit different than you're used to, and we'll explain why in a second. So step 4 is called gathering credible evidence, and this is the point at which you'll write indicators and you'll make your choices about data collection sources and methods. In step 5, you're going to put that all together and you're going to draw conclusions. You're going to review and interpret your evidence. You're going to analyze, actually review and interpret your evidence, and use it to determine whether or not the program has been a success or a failure. And then finally, it all culminates in use of lessons learned. If we've done a good job, the whole purpose of this is to use the evaluation results in a meaningful way. A key point about our framework is that those early steps are an underlying guidance for all of the things that we do in the evaluation, and particularly this idea of stakeholders and focus end up influencing how we make those choices at steps 4, 5, and 6. So that's one of the reasons that we call those steps something a little bit different than you may be used to in normal data collection processes. So, for example, we don't call step 4 collect the data, which is the core task you'll do. We call it gather credible evidence. Why? Because if you've done those early steps of engaging stakeholders and describing your program correctly, you already know what the preferences and values are of those stakeholders, which kind of evidence they give credit to, which kind of evidence they don't give credit to. You'll find some stakeholders who only want qualitative data, others who think qualitative data is baloney and they don't believe anything if it's not in numbers. In step 5, we don't call that analyze the data, we call it justify conclusions. Why? Because as we all know, there are data and then there are interpretations of data. And at this point, the data don't speak for themselves. They're always seen through a prism of values and preferences that people are going to bring. And how will we know that? Well, we'll have known that already from engaging them as stakeholders and thinking through the evaluation focus. And then most importantly, and obviously, we're not going to call step 6 report findings. We call it use lessons learned. Why? Because it's utility-focused evaluation. And what that means is we don't do the evaluation until we've identified at the start who the intended user is. The payoff for that at step 6 is that we're not doing a report and running around wildly to find someone to use it. Rather, we're creating a product that meets the needs of an identified market that we determined at the outset. Finally, let me spend a few minutes on the standards. The standards are at the center of our framework, and while some people see those as a way to do evaluation, they actually play a much different and in some ways more important role. The standards help us make informed and good choices at every individual step. And what they help us do is to remember that there's no one thing called a right evaluation or a right evaluation design. It's always going to be situation specific. So rather than telling us how to conduct evaluation, what the standards do is help us sort through the many, many options we have at any one of the 6 steps. Even a moderately complex program can easily identify dozens of stakeholders. Even a moderately complex program has hundreds of ways of gathering credible evidence. The standards help us decide how to stay at the right level, how to keep from underkill, but just as importantly, from overkill. There are 4 standards. There are actually 30 standards, but they fall into 4 groups, and that's what I want to talk about. The first group of standards relates to utility. Who needs the information from this evaluation, and what information do they need? If you apply this standard, you can easily narrow down 30 stakeholders to the 5 or 6 that matter most for this evaluation this time. You can narrow down 100 ways of collecting data to the 6 or 7 that are really going to matter most for this evaluation and the intended users of these findings. The second group of standards is feasibility. How much time, money, and effort can you really put into this evaluation this time? And the feasibility standard is very important. So many people step away from evaluation because they bring a very, very high scientific bias to what an evaluation design should look like. The feasibility standard reminds us there is no one right design. Rather, there is an intended user of findings, and there's a budget and other constraints. And then when you meld those things together, you'll figure out if you've got the time, effort, and skills to do the evaluation you need to do. The third one is propriety or ethics. Is there some approach we need to take or someone we need to engage in the evaluation for it to be ethical? So at evidence gathering, we're always going to ask ourselves, are there ethical questions that would lead us to one data collection method as opposed to another? At the stakeholder step, we're always going to ask ourselves, is there a stakeholder out there I absolutely need to engage to truly understand this program? If I'm doing a community intervention, for example, it would be unethical in many ways to not engage as one of my stakeholders the people participating in the intervention so I can detect any negative effects or negative side effects. And then finally, accuracy. What design will lead to accurate information? And we put accuracy last for a reason, not because it's unimportant, but because in the old days, accuracy was the king of the standards or the only standard. And what we brought when we brought the accuracy standard into prominence was a very scientific bias or scientific orientation to design. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Often it's exactly the most appropriate design to use. But just as often, it's overkill. And what accuracy does by being our 4th standard is to be seen as in the service of utility and feasibility. I'm going to ask myself who needs these findings. I'm going to ask myself what constraints of skill and time and effort do I have to bring to this evaluation? And then when I put those things together, I'm going to then say, is there a design out there that's accurate enough to meet the needs of this user this time and still stay within the bounds of my skills, my time, and my budget? Right? And viewed this way, often the answer is yes, there absolutely is. Whereas before, using only a scientific standard, we would often end up not evaluating anything and miss opportunities to really learn more about our program and how to improve it. So in short, 6 steps and 4 standards help ensure use of findings, and that's the whole goal of this, to get some use of findings for program improvement or conceptual understanding or a host of other uses. The steps are systematic, but they're also dynamic. The steps interact with each other, and they're inevitably iterative, and that's a good thing. The early steps are set as a frame of reference to help us make better choices in the later steps, and then the standards are at the center of the framework, and they help us at each step. They either broaden our view and keep us from underkill, and or they help us home in on the best options and keep us from overkill and remind us that evaluation is situation-specific and good choices this time may not be the same choices next time.